Problems seen from one perspective can be radically different seen from another. Consider Singapore. Fortress Singapore was thought to be impregnable. For more than 100 years it stood as an irreducible symbol of British power in Asia. And it was impregnable, viewed from the south. But the Japanese looked at it from the north, and they attacked it from the north. And within a few weeks, it had been conquered. The arguments of proponents for nuclear weapons look equally unassailable. From the beginning, the dangers of nuclear weapons were clear, but realists said, we dare not abandon nuclear weapons. The realist arguments have always, so far, carried the day. The intellectual fortress they occupy seems impregnable. Its mighty walls have withstood sustained and sometimes furious attack for 65 years. Realists shake their heads sadly when people talk about nuclear abolition. They know that abolition is impossible, an idealistic dream. They know that people who believe in long-term abolition are foolish. People who believe in abolition are utopian dreamers. And the advocates of nuclear weapons are right if you look at the world from within their worldview. Abolition is impossible, seen from their perspective. And for 67 years, almost everyone, realists, abolitionists, world government advocates, madmen, for, against, everyone, has looked at nuclear weapons from within the proponent's worldview. But since the end of the Cold War, people have started to slowly step out of that proponent's mindset and re-examine the assumptions and beliefs that have undergirded the debate. They looked at from a different perspective, if you re-examine the facts objectively, and everything changes. Suddenly, abolition is possible. Problems are not intractable, not impossible. No one does his best thinking when he's afraid, so the ideas that grew out of the Cold War are necessarily suspect. Re-examine the facts, and suddenly the arguments for nuclear weapons aren't powerful. They're preposterous. They are an unpersuasive collection of wishful thinking held together by nothing more than fear and rationalization. Abolitionists have a much stronger case than proponents, not because nuclear weapons are immoral, although they surely are. Not because nuclear weapons are dangerous, although that danger is certain beyond doubt. But because nuclear weapons are not only immoral and dangerous, they are immoral, dangerous, and stupid weapons. Nuclear weapons are too big, too clumsy, too outmoded, too messy for any conceivable purpose. But Ward, the proponents' arguments are so strong. After all, nuclear weapons shocked Japan into surrendering in World War II. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons in history. Nuclear deterrence is essential for our protection. Nuclear weapons have kept us safe for 70 years. Nuclear weapons can't be disinvented. Nuclear weapons shocked Japan into surrendering in World War II, except they didn't. Japan surrendered because the Soviet Union entered the war. Japanese leaders said the bomb forced them to surrender because it was less embarrassing to say they'd been defeated by a miracle weapon. Americans wanted to believe it, and the myth of nuclear weapons was born. Look at the facts. The United States bombed 68 cities in the summer of 1945. If you graph the number of people killed in those 68 attacks, you would imagine that Hiroshima would be off the charts, because that's the way it's always presented. In fact, Hiroshima is second. Tokyo, a conventional attack, killed more. If you graph the number of square miles destroyed, Hiroshima is sixth. If you graph the percentage of the city destroyed, Hiroshima is 17th. Clearly, in terms of its end result, I'm not talking about the means, but in terms of the actual outcome of the attack, Hiroshima was not that exceptional. It was not outside the parameters of attacks that had been going on all summer long. Hiroshima was not militarily decisive. The Soviet Union's declaration of war, on the other hand, altered the strategic situation decisively. Adding another great power to the war brought insoluble military problems to Japan. It might be possible to fight one great power attacking from one direction, but anyone could see that Japan couldn't defend against two great powers attacking from two different directions at once. The Soviet declaration of war was decisive. Hiroshima was not. After Hiroshima, soldiers were still dug in on the beaches. They could still fight. They still wanted to fight. They were ready to fight. There was one fewer city behind them, but they'd been losing cities all summer long on an average of one every other day. Hiroshima was not a decisive military event. The Soviet entry into the war was. And they said this. Japan's leaders identified the Soviet Union as the strategically decisive factor. In a meeting in June of the Supreme Council to discuss how the war was going, they said Soviet entry would determine the fate of the empire. Japan's leaders said Hiroshima forced them to surrender because it made a terrific explanation for losing the war. But the facts show that Hiroshima did not force Japan to surrender. If nuclear weapons are a religion, then Hiroshima was the first miracle. What happens to a religion when its miracles are false? Nuclear weapons shocked Japan into surrendering in World War II, except they didn't. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons in history, but destruction doesn't win wars. What nuclear weapons do best is kill civilians in large numbers. But wars are won by killing soldiers. No war has ever been won by destroying a city. No army has ever captured a city, destroyed it, and then the other side surrendered. Ever. No war has ever been won by killing civilians. No leader has said, we have to surrender now because too many civilians are dying. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons ever, but vast general destruction, killing civilians and destroying cities, doesn't win wars. As long as armies are still armed and are willing to fight, the war goes on. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons in history, but destruction doesn't win wars. Nuclear deterrence is essential for our protection, but nuclear deterrence is only safe if it's perfect. And nuclear deterrence has been far from perfect. Proponents of nuclear weapons look at the Cold War and say, nuclear deterrence has worked in every crisis so far. But that is a singularly misleading reading of the evidence. Consider Cuba. Proponents see it as proof that nuclear deterrence works. After all, the Soviets put missiles into Cuba, there was a risk of nuclear war, and then Khrushchev took them back out again. But what about Kennedy? Kennedy knew that if he took action in Cuba, either blockading the island or bombing the missiles, that he ran the risk of nuclear war. During the week of secret deliberations, when they talked about what to do, they mentioned the risk of war nuclear war 60 times. If nuclear deterrence means that leaders see a risk of nuclear war and then pull back, how do you explain Kennedy's decision? Or take the 1973 Middle East War. Proponents talk about Henry Kissinger putting U.S. nuclear forces on alert to warn the Soviets not to send troops to Egypt. See, they say, deterrence worked. But what about Sadat and Assad? Everyone knew Israel had nuclear weapons. It was reported in the New York Times. Any attack on Israel can quickly become an existential one. Breakthrough in the Golan Heights, you can be in Tel Aviv the same day. So what were the leaders of Egypt and Syria thinking? Why didn't Israel's nuclear monopoly prevent them from launching a war? Or take the Gulf War. Kevin Chilton, at one time commander of all U.S. nuclear forces, in an article in Strategic Studies Quarterly said that the Gulf War is proof that deterrence works because Secretary James Baker threatened Saddam Hussein in a letter before the war. He said, If you use chemical or biological weapons, the United States will have recourse to measures of great consequence and force, or whatever the euphemism is. And yet, if you look more closely, Baker's letter actually drew 3 red lines in the sand. Don't use chemical or biological weapons, don't set the oil wells on fire, and don't make terroristic attacks against our friends and allies. And as everyone knows, Saddam crossed 2 of those 3 lines. In baseball, if you bat .333, you get a hit every 3rd time you bat. That's pretty good hitting. I mean, you can make a lot of money as a baseball player if you bat .333. But nuclear deterrence is not baseball. Being successful in nuclear deterrence 1/3 of the time is not nearly good enough. Because the consequences of failure are so enormous, nuclear deterrence has to be perfect, or vanishingly close to perfect. And again, when you re-examine the record, and I haven't covered every failure, you find failures of deterrence. These failures did not lead to nuclear war. But that was the result of luck or happenstance, not because nuclear deterrence works like magic. Nuclear deterrence is essential for our protection, but nuclear deterrence is only safe if it's perfect. And nuclear deterrence has been far from perfect. Nuclear weapons are necessary to keep the peace, but the proof that they've kept the peace is nonsense. There's been no war between the United States and Russia for 65 years, and no major war in Europe. Proponents claim that this peace is the result of nuclear deterrence. I call this, this is proof by absence. I call this the virgins in the volcano proof. The volcano erupts, people are appalled, the priest says, to appease the gods, we need to throw a virgin into the volcano. And they throw a virgin in, a year goes by, there's no eruption, and everyone says, hey, see, it works. And they keep throwing virgins in until the next time the mountain explodes. We don't take proof by absence. We don't accept it in any situation where there are real stakes involved. Think about medicine. Imagine I find a bush in my backyard and I make an extract out of the root and I claim it prevents mesothelioma, a rare form of cancer. Let's say I give the extract to 200 people for a year and none of them develops mesothelioma. Would any credible medical organization in any country say that I had proved that the extract prevents cancer? Take airline safety. Imagine a woman invents a device that she claims prevents metal fatigue in airplanes by some previously unknown property of sonar, say. I don't know. She has a friend at the FAA in the United States, and they put these devices on 100 planes for a year, and none of those planes crashes because of metal fatigue. Now, if some airline decided that they were going to stop doing metal fatigue inspections and maintenance, and instead they were just going to rely on these devices, would you fly that airline? We don't accept proof by absence in any circumstance where there is real risk involved. Why would we rely on it where the lives of millions are at stake? Nuclear weapons are necessary because they keep the peace, but the proof that they've kept the peace is nonsense. Nuclear weapons can't be disinvented. Sometimes proponents say more vividly, you can't stuff the nuclear genie back in the bottle. This argument has won debates for 50 years. Its power comes from the fact that it is absolutely true. You can't disinvent technology. It also happens to be absolutely irrelevant. No technology is ever disinvented. Don't get me wrong, technology goes out of existence all the time. If you don't believe me, just try to get technical support for any device that's more than 5 years old. It just doesn't go out of existence by being disinvented. Technology disappears in one of two ways. One, better technology comes along. Two, people realize it was stupid technology to begin with. Consider the penny farthing. These 19th century bicycles were difficult to get up on and dangerous to fall off of. But nobody said, you can't stuff the penny farthing genie back in the bottle. When better bicycles came along with two wheels the same size, penny farthings simply went out of existence. They didn't have to be disinvented. The question is not whether nuclear weapons can or cannot be disinvented. That's a red herring. The question is whether nuclear weapons are smart military technology. On the face of it, this seems unlikely, since no one has found a situation in which the use of nuclear weapons seemed called for in the last 67 years. The genie argument is no more than a cheap debater's trick, but it is psychologically suggestive. It reveals something about proponents' thinking, because in the minds of proponents, nuclear weapons are the genie. They are magic. Wave your nuclear weapon around and people will do whatever you say. If nuclear weapons are magic, then abolition is impossible. But if nuclear weapons are clumsy, blundering, overly large, expensive, outmoded dinosaurs, then abolition takes on a different cast. Nuclear weapons can't be disinvented, but no technology is ever disinvented. We have been told for so long that nuclear weapons are awesome, that they give us magic power. The reality has gotten lost. The reality is that nuclear weapons are not very good weapons. Drop a nuclear weapon on your enemy's troops, and the radiation blows back on your own troops. Target some facility in a city, and you have to destroy 3/4 of the city in order to destroy the target. There's no question that nuclear weapons are very dangerous. It's just not clear that they're very useful. Why would you keep technology that's very dangerous but not very useful? Seeing nuclear weapons this way is a radical departure. But what if the Japanese misled all of us at the end of World War II for their own reasons? What if the US leapt to the conclusion that nuclear weapons were miracle weapons, and then somehow persuaded everyone else to believe it too? Then the Cold War froze these ideas in place and fear inflated them. What if our ideas about nuclear weapons are informed by mistakes and misjudgments and exaggerations and myths? The important task, as I see it, is to rethink nuclear weapons. We have to re-examine all the Cold War ideas very carefully. Proponents think nuclear weapons are awesome, fearful, all-powerful, magic. We need to step out of the proponents' worldview, to look objectively, and to see them with fresh eyes. It may well be that nuclear weapons are too clumsy, too outmoded, too big, too messy for any reasonable purpose. This is not an academic exercise. I'm a historian by training and a pragmatist by inclination. In my view, nuclear war still looms in the background. Remember, people in Europe did not expect war in 1914. War took them by surprise. The danger of human folly is ever present, even if we feel entirely safe. There is, therefore, a fierce urgency in this work.